This is Heart of the Guardians, where forgotten tales and human courage come alive. If you're drawn to stories of love that blooms in unlikely places and the quiet strength of those who walk alone, stay with us till the end, and don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of storytelling burning. The wind always seemed to whisper around her small cabin, carrying voices from faraway times she never quite understood. The land was vast and raw, stretching into the horizon like an endless sea of golden dust. Her name was Clara, and she had lived here alone for 7 years. 7 years of mornings where the frost clung to the window and nights where the wolves howled like lost souls searching for something they would never find. Clara had not planned to be alone. Once, she'd come here with a husband, full of hope and foolish dreams about carving a life from the wild. But the frontier had a cruel way of testing promises. He had gone out one morning to hunt and never returned. Some said the Comanche had taken him. Others said he'd gotten lost and the land swallowed him whole. Clara stopped listening. She learned to work the soil, fix the roof, and mend her clothes by the flickering light of a lantern. The loneliness didn't fade, it settled into her bones like winter cold that never quite leaves. The cabin stood by a dry creek bed, surrounded by cottonwoods that whispered at night. Each morning she'd ride into the valley to check her traps and bring back water from the spring. There was a calm rhythm to her days: wake with the light, tend to the garden, feed the chickens, and watch the sky burn orange at dusk. She spoke to the air sometimes, to the memory of her husband, to the ghosts of the prairie. It wasn't madness, it was survival. One late afternoon, the air shifted. The horizon darkened, not with storm clouds but with movement. She heard it before she saw it, the distant thunder of hooves, the deep tremor that only many horses together could make. She stood frozen, a bucket of water in her hand, eyes straining toward the ridge. At first she thought it might be cavalry patrols, she'd seen them pass once or twice. But as the riders grew closer, she saw their hair, their paint, the wildness of their movement. Comanche. 7 of them. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She ran to the cabin, bolted the door, and crouched by the window, peering through a crack. The riders slowed as they approached, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun. They were proud, fierce, and silent. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, dismounted and raised a hand, not in threat, but in greeting. For a long time, no one moved. The horses snorted, the wind carried dust around them, and Clara felt the world narrow to that single moment. She could hear her breath, quick and shallow. They called out something in their language, words she couldn't understand. Then the tall one stepped closer, his palms still raised. She hesitated, her mind racing. The stories she'd heard painted them as monsters, raiders, thieves, killers. But in that instant, looking through the crack in the wood, she saw not monsters, but men, tired, worn, dust-covered. They carried themselves with quiet strength, not cruelty. The tall one spoke again, softer this time, gesturing toward the sky. A storm was forming to the north. Dark clouds piled high and the air began to hum with static. Clara glanced toward the horizon. If they were caught out there, they could die. She didn't know why, but something in her, a buried kindness she thought she'd lost, made her unbolt the door. When she stepped out, they all turned toward her. The tall one's eyes met hers. They were dark, deep as river stones, unreadable. She raised her chin, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can stay," she said, gesturing toward the barn. "But only until the storm passes." He nodded once, then spoke to the others. They moved with quiet efficiency, leading their horses toward the shelter. She watched them, heart still racing, not from fear now but from something else she couldn't name. The wind roared that night. Rain lashed the windows and thunder shook the walls. She sat by the fire, clutching a blanket, listening to the storm and to the faint sounds from the barn. She could hear their voices, low, rhythmic, almost musical. For a moment she imagined she could understand them, that they were telling stories to keep the dark away. At dawn, she found one of the horses lame, its leg cut on a nail. She went to the barn with her medicine kit, and the tall one was already there, crouched beside the animal. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary but calm. "You know how to fix?" he asked, his accent thick but his English clear enough. She nodded. "I can try." They worked in silence, side by side. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. She could smell the earth, wet and rich. When she finished wrapping the leg, he watched her hands, then met her eyes. You live here alone, he said more as a statement than a question. Yes. He glanced around the small barn. Brave, he said simply. She almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, just stubborn. He smiled then, small, fleeting, but real. It caught her off guard, that smile. It softened the sharp lines of his face. He introduced himself, Tohano. She repeated it carefully, and he seemed pleased she got it right. The other 6 men kept their distance, respectful but cautious. They mended their gear, tended their horses, and shared quiet meals around the fire. Clara offered what food she had, though it wasn't much. In return, they brought her venison, fresh and clean, and helped stack firewood against the cold. Days passed. The storm had long gone, but they stayed, first to rest the injured horse, then because, it seemed, there was nowhere urgent they needed to be. She didn't ask questions. Some evenings, she caught Tohano watching her as she moved about the cabin. Not with the gaze of a predator, but of someone studying a mystery. Once, she asked him why they had come so far north. He looked into the fire before answering. The world changes, he said. The land grows smaller for us. We ride where we can still breathe. There was sadness in his voice, an old sorrow that had no words. Something in her heart stirred. She had lost much to this land, too. Different battles, same pain. They began to talk more, in fragments of English and gestures. She taught him words like bread, window, rain. He taught her words in Comanche, sun, water, home. When she said the last one, he looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. The bond between them grew quietly, like grass after rain. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned gold, he found her by the creek, washing clothes. He sat nearby, silent for a while. Then he said, "You have strong heart." She looked up. Strong heart. He nodded. You live. Alone, but you live. She wanted to tell him that living wasn't the same as being alive, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "Sometimes I think the land keeps me here. Maybe it's not done with me yet." He looked toward the horizon. The land keeps us all. Some fight it. Some listen. The way he said it made her think he was one of those who listened. That night, she dreamed of her husband for the first time in years. He stood by the door, looking at her, but when she tried to speak, his face faded, replaced by Tohano's. She woke with her heart racing and the dawn light spilling across the floor like a promise she didn't understand. The next day, she found Tohano carving something outside the cabin. It was a small wooden figure, a bird with outstretched wings. He handed it to her without a word. She turned it over in her hands. It was rough, uneven, but beautiful in its simplicity. "For you," he said. "You remind me of this. Alone, but free." She didn't know what to say. No one had given her a gift in years. She wanted to tell him she wasn't free, that she was bound by the ghosts of everything she'd lost, but she couldn't. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." That evening, the other men prepared to leave. The horses were rested, the sky was clear, and duty called them back to whatever trails they followed. Clara felt a strange ache as she watched them pack. Tohano stayed behind a moment longer, standing by the cabin door. "You have kind eyes," he said softly. "And brave hands. Do not forget." Her throat tightened. "Will I see you again?" He tilted his head slightly. "Maybe. The wind knows." And then he was gone, riding into the horizon with the others, leaving only dust and silence behind. For days, she tried to go back to her routine, tending the garden, mending, fetching water. But everything felt different, like the world had shifted on its axis. She kept the carved bird on the windowsill, and sometimes, when the light hit it just right, it seemed to glow. Weeks later, the first snow fell. The world turned quiet and white. Clara sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting. She had begun to think maybe it had all been a dream, some fevered illusion born of loneliness. But one morning, she found footprints outside the cabin, large, fresh, leading to the door. And hanging from the latch was a strip of red cloth, woven with beads. She picked it up, her hands trembling. She didn't need to wonder who had left it. Winter deepened. Each day was harder than the last, but the small tokens of memory kept her warm. The bird, the cloth, the echo of his voice saying her name in the wind. She realized that loneliness no longer felt like a wound. It had become something gentler, something that reminded her she was still alive. She had known loss and silence. Now she had known connection, however brief. The land around her was still vast, still wild, but it no longer seemed empty. Somewhere out there, a man rode under the same sky, and that knowledge filled her heart with a quiet kind of peace. Sometimes, at dusk, she would walk to the ridge where she'd first seen the riders. The wind would rise, whispering through the grass, and she would close her eyes and listen. And in the sound of the wind and the soft beat of her own heart, she would almost hear the rhythm of hooves fading into the distance, carrying a promise she could not name but would never forget. The frontier had taken much from her husband, her comfort, her certainty, but it had also given her something unexpected, proof that love can find its way even through the hardest soil. And though she was still alone, she no longer felt abandoned by the world. The land, in all its harsh beauty, had taught her how to endure. And somewhere beyond the horizon, she believed, the wind carried a man's quiet vow that he, too, would remember the woman who lived alone, and opened her door when 7 weary riders came seeking shelter from the storm. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. Clara sat by the window, the carved bird in her hands, the night sky alive with stars. She whispered to the quiet, not to be heard, but simply to let the words exist. "Good night, Tohano." Outside, the wind answered, carrying with it the echo of hooves and the faintest sound of a song she would never quite understand but would always feel deep within her heart. This is Heart of the Guardians, and this story reminds us that even in the loneliest corners of the earth, love can ride in unexpected, unstoppable, and unforgettable.